I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Hollie McKay, war correspondent and author of Only Cry for the Living. Hollie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Last week, a White House review of the chaotic 2021 U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan pinned the blame on the Trump administration for a lack of planning. What do you think of that assessment?
Well, I was really disappointed when I heard that assessment, but also not surprised because it is politics. But, um, unless we look at what went wrong and take some accountability and responsibility for it, then we never really learn. So I was disappointed to kind of see that the buck was being passed and there was no accountability taken by the administration when they were the people in office. President Biden is and was at that point the commander in chief. And so what happened in Afghanistan, perhaps there was planning problems with the Trump administration, but at the end of the day, the Biden administration are the ones who executed those plans and need to take some responsibility for the absolute failure that evacuation really was.
It sounds like you're saying this isn't really an accurate account of what happened. It's more revisionist history. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, it's playing the political game. It's refusing to admit fault for anything, and it's always the person on the other side's fault, which is pretty much what we see in politics across the board these days, unfortunately. And many lives were lost in that evacuation, and I think that is deeply insulting to the Marines who lost their lives, and also more than 180 Afghans also lost their lives in that evacuation process. And so I think, not sort of taking any accountability or having no regrets for what happened is really quite insulting.
I do want to take a step back here, and you actually were in Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. So, can you tell us what your experience was like?
So I moved back to Afghanistan, and that was in June, I believe, June, July of 2021. And I remember sort of getting there and just sort of being fascinated by how quickly and rapidly the Taliban were taking over these provinces, but how little planning that there was by the US-backed Kabul government at that point. You would go to the park and there would just be people that were fleeing from other provinces where there was heavy fighting and Taliban takeover and no resources for them, sort of no forward thinking. And maybe we need to get shelters. Maybe we need to somehow set up a food bank for these people. There was just sort of absolutely nothing. And there seemed to be this collective denial that anything was really going to happen. And everywhere I went, the soldiers on different bases were convincing me that it was going to be fine, that there was not going to be any imminent fall of the government. And really, even the intelligence that I was receiving from the Kabul side really painted that same strange picture, too. But when you looked at it from a practical standpoint, it was very clear that the country was falling apart. And I think a real signal of that to me was about a week before the fall. I went past a base and I remember just seeing these soldiers with their weapons and they were running and leaving. And I looked at them and I said, "Where are you going?" And they said, "We're leaving. We've had enough. We're going home." I said, "So you're not coming back to fight?" And they said, "No." And you just started to see that more and more rapidly as it sort of got closer to that fall. And then I was in the northern city of Mazar Sharif, which is about sort of a 12-hour drive from Kabul. It's up near the Uzbekistan border when that fell, and that fell the day before Kabul. And again, the night before, I'd been out with commandos who were convincing me that there was absolutely no way that they were going to leave their post, that they were going to fight to the end. And the same commandos that I spoke to as everything was falling the next day, they were all sort of on the run trying to get to different border areas. So it just fell apart very, very quickly. And even as it was sort of falling apart, again, intelligence people in Kabul were telling me, "Oh, it's fine. It's going to hold for at least a couple more days. You'll be able to get back," which of course wasn't the case. So you can see there was just this vacuum of information and so many inaccurate things that were being passed around that you really couldn't rely on any information that was coming.
It sounds like the writing on the wall was really there, but I'm really curious. Do you think those commandos were lying to you, or did they think, hey, I'm actually going to stay and fight? And then, once things started shifting, they changed their minds?
Yeah, I think, and I do feel for him. The Commandos really weathered a lot of that fight for many years in Afghanistan. But a lot of these soldiers were really sold out by their leadership. So what happened was and often a lot of the fighting, was more about having tea and talking rather than, huge amounts of bomb blasts. And when they came into Mazar, there was absolutely sort of no fight back. So a lot of it was really just about talking. And the Taliban was very good at being able to negotiate strategies with local warlords, and also with the leaders of the different A&A units. And so what happened was the leaders and sort of the top brass, they were given this kind of heads up. Okay, well, we'll make an agreement. We'll allow the Taliban to come in. They'll allow us safe passage out first, or there'll be some sort of negotiation. So a lot of the time, these foot soldiers are really just left to the slaughter. And so I know in the case of the Commandos, when they realized that their leaders had all left, and that, General Dostum, who was the one who invited me to the Tsar, who was a sort of a very prominent warlord, he'd also left. And mind you, these soldiers were not given the heads up. They were basically out on the front lines and then realized that they basically been sold out. So at that point, of course, the morale drops, and then it's sort of this collective decision to you stay and fight and likely die, or you try to save your own life. And that's really where that self-preservation kicks in, and they run to wherever they think is the safest point.
When you're with these soldiers on the front lines who realize, hey, my leader is gone, like you said, that morale is at an all time low and they're fleeing, what do you do and what are you feeling?
I remember, at that point, I mean, it's sort of a very sad, helpless feeling, really. And I sort of didn't feel that much different to them, in the sense that there really wasn't anywhere for me to go at that point either. And I certainly didn't have a way out, or, any sort of safe passage, or an ability, beyond what they did, I guess, to get out. So I think it's just a really helpless sort of feeling. It's a sad feeling because you look at how much blood and treasure had been dedicated to the war at that point, in 20 years worth of conflict, and that it really had amounted to this. And I think the hardest thing for me was, understanding that I probably, I was going to put my head together. I was going to figure out a way, and I have a little blue passport that allows me eventually to get out if I make that decision to do that. But the people living there, they don't have that luxury of being able to leave. And so for them, it's, the stakes are much higher, and they have to spend the next chapters of their lives sort of dealing with this very new reality. So just all around, it's a very strangely quiet, sort of somber experience. It's not sort of explosions and things that we think happens in a fall. It happens quite seamlessly, and without a lot of fanfare, and in some ways that, it makes it all the more haunting.
The coverage of that was so harrowing. I mean, I just remember the images of a parent passing their toddler up to Marines over a wall, people chasing a US Air Force aircraft, trying to stop it, trying to like hang on to the wings. So, what made you decide, hey, I'm going to stay? I mean, you mentioned your passport. Why didn't you go to Kabul and get out of there?
I made the decision to stay because, well, in the end, I had to get out of the room that I was in Mazar. At that point, the hotel, sort of, with a couple of young guys that were working there who stayed to basically take care of me and my photographer who was with me. They were very scared. They'd worked for Afghan intelligence previously, and they were scared and wanted to go home. And the Taliban was sort of persistently trying to get in downstairs. So I started to feel I didn't want to burden them or become a threat to them any more than I already was. And, food was starting to run out and that sort of thing. So several days into it, I made the decision that I would contact the Taliban, and I knew I sort of had an intermediary that was able to help with that. And I would just have to kind of take that risk of telling them who I was. And at that point, we didn't know how they were going to treat a woman, a Westerner, a reporter. So it was a gamble, but I felt confident enough in that was really my only decision. I'd have several talks with the US State Department and other avenues, and it was very clear to me that there was no other sort of viable option at that point. So I made that decision to contact several elders who came, and I had to sort of get into their car and then when I started to talk to them, they were surprisingly open to having a journalist there. And they were very, at that point, and things have changed a lot now, but at that point, were very keen to try to sell this narrative that the Taliban was very different to the Taliban in the 90s. And so they basically, said, well, if you need a letter or permission to stay, then we can, point you in that right direction. And I felt confident enough in that conversation. And also, I'd had a few discussions with some other British photographer friends in Kabul who had also said that they were going to stay. And so I chose not to sort of get on those evacuation flights, and I chose to stay for the next 5 months in Kabul to kind of see how things unfolded. And I felt that as a journalist, that was a really crucial time to be there, not only because everybody was leaving, but because we were dealing with this completely new reality and a completely new government. And nobody really knew where that was going to go. And I figured that just because my government was leaving a country, it really didn't mean that I had to, and that the stories had to as well. And so I felt that it was an important time to stay.
Hollie, I really want to ask you about the Taliban, but first, you did mention that you did contact the State Department. Were they helpful? Were they in a sort of denial? What were they like in talking to you?
I don't think there was a denial at all. I think the State Department workers that were in Kabul were absolutely just in over their heads. They were inundated. It was an incredibly chaotic situation to be in. I'm sure that none of them were getting any sleep. And they were very responsive whenever I reached out, and in terms of checking in and things like that. But in terms of actual logistical solutions, there wasn't too many of those. However, there was, one, wonderful diplomat that I worked with a little bit in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, who also helped facilitate that sort of initial opening with the Taliban. And to my surprise, when I did say to my point person that I was speaking with, I think I need to contact the Taliban. I think this is the best way to do it. I expected them to sort of balk at that and say no, but surprisingly, they were quite receptive to that and said, "Well, yeah, that could be an option." So I was grateful for that I didn't get pushback, because that would have made it a little bit more daunting, I think, to make that decision. But they seemed to sort of support that, and that's probably in large part because they didn't have any other real logistical solutions of their own. So. As supportive as they were verbally, I felt that I was very much left to my sort of own devices to figure out how to get out.
And you said the Taliban was trying to convince you that they weren't the same Taliban of the 90s. Was that true?
I think initially we saw really a surprising change, and the Taliban were very open to journalists. They wanted journalists to come in. Um, there really wasn't a huge amount of red tape to get into different ministries or to facilitate interviews. So it was, at first, it was sort of this, I'd say for the first month, this kind of very strange free for all. I remember even going to a suicide bombing school and basically just knocking at the door. It was sort of a secret school that was in a kindergarten outside Kabul. And we just knocked on the door, and they kind of let us in and told us all about this suicide bomb training, which probably wouldn't happen now. But at that point, they really wanted to try to show that they were trying to bring peace to their country, and that they had just a very different way of thinking, I suppose. And you also had, for the first time, this country that was just completely opened up, and you were suddenly able to travel by road to all these different provinces that in the past was absolutely unthinkable because of the danger level. So the first sort of month or two, it was yeah, it was incredibly open. And then you started to really see that shift start to happen again. And you saw the Taliban kind of coming in with different rulings and different restrictions on media, and telling Taliban that they weren't allowed to talk to certain people. And sort of gradually, those restrictions seemed to become firmer and firmer, and less of the Taliban officials were willing to be so open as they were. And it was sort of very gradual over the next few months. And I did go back to Afghanistan last year, and I found it to be just an incredibly challenging place to work in terms of, I was detained 3 times. Once in that year, and then twice on my last trip. And then just being a journalist and being a woman and sort of trying to function was certainly a lot harder than it had been at the beginning. And so I think my assessment of it now is really that the Taliban very much is returning to the Taliban of the 90s. Whereas at first there was this sort of small slither that maybe they had changed. But I think rulings started to come down from the supreme leader, and that very much squashed any chance of progress.
You were detained 3 times. As a journalist, I can't imagine that. The fear, you're just trying to do your job, get the news out there. Would you go back to Afghanistan?
Definitely would. I think it would be, again, I don't even know if they would let me back. I don't even know that I would be able to get a visa to go back. I'm sure they're not particularly happy with me. And the Taliban are very media savvy. They have an entire sort of wing dedicated to reading every article about them, to really doing this deep dive on journalists when they go. And even with my last trip, before I could get, even though I had the visa, before I could get an actual permit to work, they had to have, this sort of intelligence unit do background on me and check what I'd written about them in the past and all sorts of things. So they're very sort of thorough about that, so to speak. And most journalists I know have either voluntarily left or basically been kicked out of the country because the Taliban has not liked what they've written or had to say. So my first hurdle would be, if I could get a visa, but certainly if I could, I would go back because I still think it's really important to continue to tell their stories. I still have people that are very near and dear to me that live there that I, would want to see. And I think Afghanistan, it's played such an important part of so many of our lives that I wouldn't want to see it forgotten. And I think that's always the struggle, is when conflicts are sort of no longer the hot spot, or they get the media attention, then also donations dry up as well. And all of a sudden the people's lives are even far worse than they were during war. So I think it's always really important to try to keep the limelight on these issues and what's happening as much as we can.
That's a really interesting point. And as of now, we're sitting about a year and a half from that really chaotic withdrawal. Based on your on-the-ground reporting, who do the people of Afghanistan blame for that chaos? I mean, it was called disastrous. Is it the Trump administration, the Biden administration, or just the United States in general?
I think the thing with Afghans is I really was surprised in large part that there was no huge bitterness toward the US. Of course, in pockets, yes, but overall, people they were very aware of what the United States had brought to their country and the development and the programs and the education and other things, and they were very grateful for that. I think many Afghans realized that the US and other countries couldn't be there forever. So I think there was sort of a disappointment is probably the better word that they felt. But I also think that many were very aware of the corruption in their own government. Certainly for me, I see that as really being the number one reason why Afghanistan essentially failed. And that was just the systemic corruption on a level that I'd never seen from absolutely every tier of government, of NGO, of any contract work that was happening there. Everybody was taking a side swipe of money. And the money that we as US taxpayers were paying for Afghanistan really never went to where it was supposed to be. So Afghanistan's chance of surviving without kind of the proper resources, I think, was always very slim. And to me, that was the big mistake that multiple administrations that oversaw Afghanistan, from Bush to Obama to Trump and then to Biden, really never paid enough attention to, was that level of corruption. And at the end of the day, the Taliban were able to kind of overcome that. And I think that is the biggest lesson that I hope that the US takes away from what happened in Afghanistan, was I just never seen anything like it.
Biden had promised that he was going to pull troops out of Afghanistan. And when National Security Council official John Kirby was asked if President Biden had any regrets about the withdrawal, he said that the president was proud of the people who conducted it. What do you think of that?
I think it's hard to. I mean, I wouldn't want to put blame on any of the people that had to conduct it, because at the end of the day, orders are orders, and they come from the top, and the top are not the people that are on the ground in Afghanistan having to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So I think that the people and the workers and the soldiers and everybody there work to the best of their ability with very limited resources, with a very chaotic situation, with an airport that really wasn't equipped to facilitate that kind of evacuation. I mean, we could argue Bagram should have been kept open. There were a lot of other things that should have been done to make that transition or that allocation out much easier. Things like visas were not done in advance for SIV people. There are people that are still waiting for their SIV now. Those things are all administrative things that could have been handled in advance to make the situation a lot smoother. Of course, they weren't. And that was really came down to the fact that they were rushing a timeline, that Biden had this timeline of September 11 and really wanted to stick to that, even though the reality on the ground showed that that really wasn't going to be very viable, that you had this sort of very small, basically 2 week window to try to do this sort of mammoth task, and that wasn't really very doable. But of course, those on the ground were executing the orders that they had, and so I think that they did to the best of their ability. It was just overall very poor planning, and it needed to have been a much more stretched out process with a lot more access points.
This war spanned over 4 administrations. From your perspective of actually being in Afghanistan for stretches of time at a time, where do you think the blame lies?
I mean, I think that at the end of the day, the Afghans need to also take responsibility for their country. No country can really fight for you. And as we saw with Afghans leaving, if Afghans are not willing to fight for their country, how can other countries sort of be expected to fill that void? I think, of course, the US does have certain degrees of blame in turning a blind eye to the corruption. In a lot of the military equipment, may have not been best suited to the Afghan fighting style. These are, guerrilla sort of trench warfare fighters, if you go back to the Soviet war days. So things like having an $80 million Air Force, while it might look really fancy, it's not probably the most practical thing for an Afghan fighting force. So there are certainly those things which the US and its partners really need to look at. But I do think at the end of the day, um, Afghans need to look at themselves. They need to look at what they did wrong, because no one can fight for your country but you. And what we sort of saw was that Afghans at the end of the day often didn't have that sense of patriotism or willingness to sort of hold that fight. They don't, I hate to generalize, but there wasn't that mammoth love for country that I've seen in other places. For many Afghans, it was more about sort of collecting a paycheck and making sure that they could bring food home to feed their families. And so I think that in any country, unless you're willing to sort of stand up and fight and to defend it, you are never going to win.
Hollie McKay, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.